Mindful Coach podcast. Hello and welcome to this edition of the Mindful Coach podcast. I'm your host, Brett Hill, founder of the Mindful Coach Association. And one of the great joys in my life is being able to talk to some amazing people who are doing courageous and powerful work in the world. And one of my favorite people to talk to is Mark Leonard, who's with us today, who is the director of Mindfulness Connected. Mark has searched for a means to make meditation accessible to mass audiences since the early 2000s. He played a key role in establishing the Oxford Mindfulness Center, which he opened in 2008, and then adapted mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for the workplace. The result is a series of innovations he calls mindfulness-based organizational education. You'll see that references MBOE in his literature and elsewhere. And it represents a new way of approaching and fostering social leadership and systemic change based on the principles of mindfulness. So welcome to the show, Mark.
Oh, hello, Brett. Lovely to talk to you again. And I'm sure it's not going to be the last time.
I should hope not. Oh my God.
Or otherwise, but it's always good. Always great fun to talk.
Oh my God. It's like every time I talk to Mark, for the listeners, it's like, I wish I was on a podcast because we have such fabulous conversation. We were having a really great conversation just before the show on, working with people who have congested about what do I do next and approaches. That was worthy of recording in and of itself because to me, I'm just going to be straight up. He's a brilliant man. He's just fascinating to talk to. And he just recently, his work was recognized. Can you tell us about this notification, this recognition that your work just received?
Okay, well, to put it in context, I think people within the mainstream mindfulness movement have been looking for ways to expand the reach of the sort of standard mindfulness programs for wider audiences, but they were looking for ways to be able to define mindfulness courses that outside of the clinical idea of courses that are fundamentally based on an intensive or semi-intensive meditation course. And because I'd adapted mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to the workplace, you've got to do a number of things like make the meditations much shorter, and you've got to do much more stuff about explaining how it works. And they asked me, I think it was 2020, they asked me to submit my program that I developed, mindfulness-based organizational education, for scrutiny to try and understand how to create a new definition for a new class of mindfulness courses. So
just real quick, you said they asked you. Who is they?
They were at that time the representatives from the Dutch Mindfulness Teachers Association and the British Mindfulness Teachers Association, and so they came together and they wanted to sort of have a look at a program as a pilot to see how they could come up with a new set of criteria to validate a new type of approach that meant that there was a wider possibility for a wider application of mindfulness to different audiences without people that was clear, that what it was clear, rather than it just being about, this is a long intensive program that isn't relevant, so we'll just chop it down. It's trying to understand what principles you've got to look at in order to make a reduced a shorter mindfulness program to make it work. So that's what they wanted to look at with my program, because it was one of the few workplace programs or short workplace programs that ever been actually subject to quite a well-designed trial in the workplace, and then the outcomes were actually published in an academic journal. So they had a good reason to say, well, this has gone through quite rigorous examination, so we can use that as an example to work out, to try and come up with an idea of what it could be, that how we could define a new type of program that wasn't the mainstream therapeutic long program. And then that became this international panel for acknowledgement of mindfulness-based programs that was under the European Association of Mindfulness-Based, of Mindfulness Teachers Association. So that was just sort of slightly different administrative thing, but the pilot, the examination then becomes sort of international, European-wide recognition, and then that recognition became indefinite at their last meeting. So that's the technical administrative process that we've got to. So it's
got a long history of being vetted and checked out, and finally they stamped it and said, this is like forever evergreen good at this point. It's like, that's amazing. And so this is mindfulness-based organizational education. So tell us about how you went about validating that these short mindfulness meditations are effective. And you can go to a business and say, this. If you'll just do this, this will work.
Well, partly because I had come from working in an environment that was, quite rigorous in its approach to scientific validation, i.e. the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, not being a researcher, not being a clinical psychologist, but I have a scientific background and a meditation background and a sort of teaching background and training background. So I wanted to respect the provenance of the scientific approach that established the importance of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And it's that scientific work in clinical trials that really triggered the international explosion of interest in mindfulness meditation, 15, 20 years ago. So I wanted to maintain consistency with that approach and continue to look at this from as far as possible, to look at this, validate changes scientifically and adapt the approach, being as faithful to a scientific approach as possible. So first of all, I started to teach a short version based on Mindfulness, a Practical Guide to Finding Peace in a Frantic World, which is a sort of short version of MBCT for stress that became a very popular self-help book, and I think is probably the most significant self-help book, again, of the last 20 years or so, that has...
What was the book again?
Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Finding Peace in a Frantic World, which was co-authored by Professor Mark Williams and Dr. Danny Penman as an adaptation of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Mark Williams is one of the 3 researchers that developed mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and then got another award, funded award to do further research and set up and in Oxford, and then that's how we set up the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, working with. I was coming from the sort of Buddhist studies side of things, supporting that work, and then out of that, the Oxford Mindfulness Centre became an idea that was hatched that we set up.
And so the work that
and that I played a role in setting it up.
And so the work that you're doing, you're focusing on, how is it different than this traditional, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy? Or what's the one of the key insights that kind of moved you to create this?
Yeah. So first of all, you're shifting from a program that has been designed to prevent recurrence of depression, that has 2-hour classes with 35, 40-minute meditations over 8 weeks, to a shorter course that had 1-hour classes with 10, 15, 20-minute guided meditations, and a lot more teaching and explanation, because people in the workplace are not going to do something because you tell them to do it. They want to understand how it's so you have to create a familiar workplace environment, a training environment. So it had to adapt from a therapeutic context to a workplace stress management context that was a training environment.
So rather than going to like a Buddhist center, meditation center, and doing the meditations, you're actually taking this into the workplace. So the environment's important. And then what you said.
So, but there's already the change to a clinical environment from a Buddhist environment with the therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. I mean, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, again, was based on mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Right.
That was a secularized primarily Buddhist meditation system, but it was secularized and taught in a hospital environment, but it didn't have the scientific foundations from cognitive therapy. So
this marries the cognitive therapy technical credentials with the incoming Buddhist foundational practices.
Or a secularized version,
right.
Then given a cognitive therapy explanation of how it works, and then applied to treat, to prevent depression as a cognitive therapy.
Amazing.
It's just slowly shifting the language and the context to become more scientific.
Okay. And so now you've taken that and said, how can we adapt this for a business?
For stress management in the workplace.
And so go ahead, please.
So that we did some studies on that, and that seemed to be effective. We didn't have good enough data to publish it. And through that experience, I really came to the conclusion that the social learning process was more important than the meditations.
Okay, so I'm going to put a punctuation mark on that. The social learning process was more important than the meditation, because that is a huge pivot right there. Because what I hear you saying is that the way people learn this was realized, empowered more by the interaction than the practice of the meditation.
I'm not saying that the practice of the meditation wasn't important.
No, of course not.
But I'm saying the emphasis in what I observed in the way it worked was that people learning together, learning about how their minds work, and then doing a short mindfulness meditation together in a group seemed to have positive effects, even though they might only do a 10-minute guided practice for 1 hour a week, or not, and then many of them I could see weren't following up during the week doing the meditations.
A mindfulness instructor has never heard of that before.
But the point is, we were getting good results, and I could see it happening. And it seemed to me that it was this people learning together about how their minds work coming from a kind of, a biologist's background that had some, I'm not trained as an anthropologist. I'm not, but I have some biological evolutionary understanding about how human beings as social animals worked. I began to see that this seems to make sense, that this is a social process, that human beings are designed as social animals, and they're learning from each other about how their minds work with each other. And it came, and so with that insight, I then thought that I wanted to make a program that was explicitly about people coming together, applying those principles of understanding how their mind works as a social mind to as culture change in an organization, rather than about fixing people for the stress that they had. I.e., we're all stressed as individuals. That's the way it is.
You think?
But when we come together and we understand each other, we feel safe.
Yeah.
And that is how we feel well and whole, is when we feel safe in a group. And over the last 15 years or so, ideas like psychological safety have become more recognized as the foundation of all sorts of positive aspects of organizational behavior, organizational psychology, based on this idea of psychological safety. And then, I've in a lot 3 years ago, first study published finding that the social factors may well be more important than the actual meditations in standard meditation programs, and people beginning to realize more and more that these social interactions and how we understand each other and how we communicate with each other, at least, have become more and more important about what the kind of outcomes we're looking for when we use something like mindfulness meditation.
Yeah, and there's this whole movement in like executive leadership and also in business organizations where people are beginning to focus on how the leaders and how the people who are decision makers show up, and the way that they engage is more important determiner of their effectiveness than precisely what they do.
Exactly, yeah, or what they say, or the theories, or the answers they give. These are all less important in terms of the long-term outcomes of performance of the organization, of the team. The way people in that team are encouraged to develop understandings with each other and exploit what I would describe as a capacity for a group mind that comes out of the social learning process when people feel psychologically safe. They're not afraid of describing problems or mistakes, because they are the opportunity for learning.
Yeah.
These are fundamental aspects of psychological safety and how it works. But it's a question of how you achieve that from a mainstream approach. This is about a leader's responsibility to influence the behaviors of a team or people in the workplace. But from my point of view, we can teach people in the team to be empowered to create this frontline culture, which is based on self-awareness of how they create a sense of self and other in the conversations they have, teaching people basic skills to listen rather than give advice, to build psychological safety, and then explain to them why, to understand why this is important and why this has to come first before tackling the problems that need, the business related challenges that need to be solved.
I really like the emphasis you have in all of your work about explaining why. And there's like a Mark Leonard's principles of design, and that's like one of them. How did you come to that? That's like a criterial part of your design and your training, to explain to people exactly what's going on and then have them practice in a social environment. I guess what I'm trying to get to is, like in other places I've been to about mindfulness, it's more like just do it. The learning is in the experience rather than the explanation.
Well, I mean, there are my own human life experiences that have been frustrated by asking questions of people in apparent authority and say why. And normally what one gets is the reality is that most people haven't asked those questions, and they do what they do because they've been told to do it, and they believe that and they've never questioned it. And when you question them, they feel threatened, and they don't want to admit the fact that they don't understand the mechanism.
So it could be a generational question authority issue here in a certain way, perhaps.
Yeah. So it just so happens that I, had that nature for one reason or other to say, I want to know why. And until you can explain to me why, I'm not going to feel comfortable doing it. Now, that just happens to be in my nature.
Well, I think it's in a lot of people's nature, actually, particularly in business context. It's like, I need for this to make sense. And so I appreciate that. There was another, let's see, the question I was going to ask you, if I can just get back to the me that was curious a minute ago. It had to do with the social, the social aspects of this, and how did you first, was there an event where you just noticed this? Was it, or that the social aspects of it were what was empowering your work here, or this work? Was it a moment of realization, or did it just kind of come over a period of time?
It was a gradual thing with the experience of teaching in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. My initial motivation was to get involved with making, let's call it mindfulness, more accessible to a wider population. Society was about trying to find a way to drive systemic change in society, because I was, coming from an environmental management background, and I was very concerned about the future of life, human life on planet
and
Earth.
I think we're still a little concerned about that.
Yeah. And I couldn't see a solution. I mean, I still can't see a solution, to be honest. But I thought at least there was a way, that there was a possibility that to gain it, creating a way where we started socially to really look at ourselves and what drives our behaviors might start to create changes in the way society and the economy worked.
Mm-hmm.
And that could lead to systemic change that would enable us to manage the way we use the environment, use our natural resources and the environment in a way that could mean that we could survive as a species. Now, the jury's still out. I'm not going to speculate about what our chances are or not. Yeah. But whatever is the case, it's not going to happen unless we do this.
Yeah, and so you were moved to try to find a way to have a big impact. And if I understanding, you were saying that the way to do that is to make these skills, this practice, reach more people. And a good way to do that is in the business world where the people are.
Yeah. Well, that's how things went after, then it was like, setting up the Oxford Mindfulness Centre. This is going to make something happen.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good way of establishing a powerful influence on society, creating an institution that researches into meditation, mindfulness meditation at Oxford. Big deal. Just that sounds good. Well, that's going to have all going to create credibility. So that was my first message. But again, the point that I'm making is that this was still about an idea of teaching individuals these practices, and I was coming from an angle that was not strictly speaking about mindfulness. It was a type of meditation that was more to do with ethical practice, meditation combined with ethical practice and philosophical insight. Mindfulness is from a Buddhist point of view, mindfulness kind of fits one part of a whole series of practices within a part of a holistic approach to developing the individual. Mm-hmm. And I was still coming from that idea of the individual.
Sure.
But what I began to realize was, through my teaching experience in the workplace, that the social learning process, I began to see the social learning process as being more important, and that the sense of self, there was a point at which clicked in my mind that the idea of the individual was at the foundation of the problem that we face in society, this separate psychological self. Mm-hmm. And that we could begin to see how this separate psychological self changed when we did exercises with others using mindfulness practice, to see how our internal narrative changed in different contexts. So that then enabled us to see that this thing that we cling to as me is a phantom. Yeah. And therefore we shouldn't necessarily do what it's telling us to do.
Exactly.
Okay. And that if it feels better for me to disappear because I'm building an interesting, psychologically safe friendship that's better than being in the corner saying, well, I'm this, that, and the other, and I need to do this, and I'm better than you, and I'm going to tell you how to do this. So it's teaching people the experience of feeling less self-defined.
By being more
that
connected.
Experience feels, and it's a feeling of being more connected. It's a feeling of being safe and secure. And the self doesn't come into this because the self is there about defending the self when it feels threatened.
Right. I hear what you're saying.
And then you give people that experience. You go, look, what's the big deal about this thing called me? This is, let's not get too stuck on it. So you're giving people an insight into that as well. Understanding the problems that, actually when the story of me comes up, that's a red flag. It's not something we should be really trying to cling to. It's something we should then investigate as a sign of a problem.
You might be very interested in. I spent a lot of years, actually, and many hours in these group process called Matrix Leadership Training by Amina Nolan, and so powerful, and it has many of the elements that you're talking about. We would sit in these circles for days, and what we discovered is I discovered is that gave me lots of opportunities to explore how I'm going to use kind of unusual language, how I do myself in groups. Like, how does Brett show up in groups? Like, because I found out there's a way I do that, and it didn't actually, and it wasn't my normal way of being with people. And so I began to realize I have a group Brett that's different than my non-group Brett. And I really got a chance to really explore that duality, if you will, in myself, and wasn't really aware of until I immersed myself in that. Yeah. But
there's only one group Brett, is there?
What's that again?
There's only one of those group Bretts, is there?
Right, exactly. Depending on the group, right? So I'm kind of but what I was going to land on here is that one of the key components of her work was this trust, and the way she literally would weave a fabric of communication by facilitating person-to-person interaction within that what she called the eyes and ears of the whole, and was super powerful. And so after he's sitting around and everybody talks to each other, and so the point, because you normally when you're in a group, you talk to the group. So it's like one to many, and she would facilitate one-to-one communications in the context of the group. So when you do that for a while, basically a very amazing thing happens. Enough trust gets established, enough groundwork that whenever the fabric of that gets strong enough, the differences can then enter. And because it wasn't, and it wouldn't tear the fabric of the group, because there was enough strength in the relationships that people could talk about the fact, well, I'm the only Black person in the room, or I'm the only person that's, over 60 in the room, or I'm the only person that's got, and those things could begin to enter into the group. And it was not fatal in a way to the trust that was established. Amazing stuff.
Yeah. Well, this is very, I the principles are exactly the same. It just so happens that it's building on a series of arguments that come from how mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is taught and then adapt. It's just a different evolutionary history to a very similar approach for a specifically slightly different context. It's not trying to say that all of a sudden we're going to create a team full of enlightened individuals. What it means is that we're giving people in the workplace a principle of understanding how to be self-aware in relationship with others, and that how they go about interacting and the language that they use has an impact on that cascades from one incident or moment of their experience to the next, and the experience of the person that they're interacting with, so that they are empowered to influence the way the culture emerges in a group or an organization. And they also have a responsibility, not just a power. to do
I
this.
agree completely. I think that you don't
Yeah.
really become an adult until you take that responsibility.
Yeah.
And so I hear what you're saying exactly. And as you're saying that, I think I've never thought of it this way before, but it's like thinking of an organization as almost like a brain, and each
Exactly.
individual is a neuron, and so whatever it fires, it connects to other neurons.
Yeah.
And if you're
Yeah.
firing fear and loathing and hatred and that inspires a whole network of that.
This is what I'm calling the group mind.
Yeah.
I.e., the mind is a social process.
Yes.
It is not an individual.
So
it's not an individual
the mind
function.
is a social process. See, that's a book right there.
Yeah.
The mind is a social process. That's going to be the name of this podcast. That's really powerful. Yeah, and it's so true because, our minds are formed in relationship, because no baby can live alone. It's formed, it survives by its relationship, by its ability to have an effective, nurturing relationship, because if it doesn't, it won't survive. And so it goes to the core of us. It really does. So tell us about the mindfulness-based organizational work that you're doing. Have you seen, are there like some stories or case studies about the effectiveness of this where it's been tried?
Well, there was I delivered a series of 6 programs for hospital staff in 2016, and then the study was done, and that was published in 2020. And since then, I've done a number in the community, 1 or 2 organizations, short programs, but I've not really had the opportunity to really teach this broadly in the workplace. It's a struggle getting clients.
Yeah, I hear you.
And there are a number of obstacles that really to this. I mean, it's the general perception of mindfulness as a stress management tool, and it's a lack of understanding of this nature of the social mind. It's counterintuitive, or it challenges the whole structure of hierarchical organizations.
Right. So it's a little bit daunting.
You are saying, you're under potentially you're trying to explain something that is outside of the reality that most people are able to function in, to try and sell something so you're trying to explain something that doesn't really register.
Yeah.
There's not a market for it.
Yeah.
Because people aren't aware of it.
This is
what has happened.
This is a classical marketing problem, particularly in the mindfulness world, where people what they need, they don't know they need, and so you can't convince people of a need they have when they don't realize that's what. And you might be looking at them going, if you're a doctor, you really need to take this vitamin D, and they're going, no, I'm eating enough lettuce, and they don't know that's what they need.
And so really the work in this field that I've done in the last nearly 10 years or so has been more about being an agent of change within the field than it has been about being able to provide.
So you're a mindfulness mole.
And I think it's about changing the language to create a market, to create change.
So that's exploring that.
And that's, if you like, the way the program has ended up being recognized is a recognition of that work.
I see.
If you like, as much as anything else. And it's also saying to mindfulness teachers within the field, look, we're legitimizing something else that might not necessarily fit your expectations as to what you have learned is a mindfulness program in your training. It's still, I still believe that somebody needs to be able to have a fairly well-developed mindfulness meditation or meditation practice to be able to understand to experientially understand why the internal narrative is not the most useful thing to identify with.
Well, exactly so. I feel like in my work, it's like I trained a lot with some pretty powerful folk, and we talked a little bit about, my work with Ron Kirch and my study with Ron Kirch before the show, and who was the founder of Hakomi. And I've had the good fortune to have learned some really incredible people. And at one point I'm stepping back, kind of looking at the lay of the land of, here's all these meditation practices I've learned, they're really powerful. And here's these martial art processes I've learned, and they're really, all of these things really add something to my sense of like what's possible with people. Because I was really went after what can a human being do. I mean, really went after it, not in a casual inquiry way. And I came up with some things and kind of stepped back, and I thought, it seems to me, and it's just like you said, it seems to me like nothing happens with the human mind until you realize that you are not your thoughts. And when you really truly get that you are not your thoughts, that there's something deeper going on here, then that opens a door to a much bigger experience that cannot otherwise be known. And so that all of my work pivoted around, just want to help people have that first realization.
Yeah. And yeah, your there are all sorts of obstacles involved in that.
Yes, there
are. In itself. And then I think one needs to find a very well-designed container for that process. A well-designed container for a well-designed process that reveals this experience. And that's one way of describing this work.
Yeah, I like that notion of the container, because it's probably something
and that's got to be that's got to feel natural. It's got to feel right in context. It's got to reflect some deeply human patterns of behavior
so powerful,
that are implicitly understood. And I think, human beings have been doing this since the beginning of time, and an anthropologist might call this ritual. But we don't go into a workplace and talk about ritual. We talk about training. But we are following very similar sets of social activities and processes to lead a person to experience this loss of separate self within a group, to be able to work together. And then we're designing that process, and we're making it accessible, comprehensible, and reasonable, and then inviting a taste of that experience as being the touchstone of where we need to work together to be able to excuse me, as an experience to reproduce, and then giving basic techniques to do that, which do include, simple mindfulness meditation practices and conversational practices that give people pointers to understand why it's not helpful. What they need to do is learn to ask questions and listen rather than give opinions.
Yeah.
As a basic pattern.
Yeah, that's like
and practicing that.
Right.
And there's a point at which I think a conversation leads to a statement of whether it's fact or truth. It's like, well, this is where we are, what do you reckon? Is that it? Now we can start to talk about what we do about it. And I think you've got to build the trust to get to the place where we feel safe to be able to let go of denial, or move on from denial to face the reality of the situation that we confront.
When you're talking about the situation being kind of oppressive, perhaps, or kind of like not really wanting to acknowledge the facts of it, the truth of it.
Well, it could be the fact. It could be to do with climate change. This isn't very comfortable. I'm also thinking about it on a one-to-one basis. I was, we were talking earlier about sort of the daily work that I do, visiting people in the community with mental health problems, and I have a lot of freedom in this role because I'm not working as a counselor or a therapist. I'm working as a support worker, so I'm a human being. I'm going into these environments, and we were talking about what I think is the fundamental principle that isn't well understood in any field, really. It might be described quite well in person-centered approaches, which is, unconditional positive regard, empathy and authenticity. But what does that really mean? What it really means, in my view, is being able to say, I'm interested in understanding what's going on for you, and I'm not judging you, but it's easy to say I'm not judging you. I have to be aware of the fact that there's a point at which I go, oh, I think this person should do X, Y, and Z, and just not saying it, and ruling that out because it's obvious to that person. But there's a point at which I can say to that person, when they've gone round and round in circles, I say, so you're saying you can't do this because of this, and you can't do that because of this. And I say, well, what are you going to do about it? I can't do anything. The only thing at some point, you've got to work out, you want to do something about that, and then we can do something. That is the fact, if you like. You admitted it. But they've got to get to a place where they can take it from you because they know that you aren't judging them as wrong or failures of some description.
Yeah, you're just reflecting back to them their scenario, their situation.
But there's something in you that has to be able to not be frustrated at this person's lack of ability to move forward.
Right.
And you have to do that because the only way you can do that is when you realize how difficult it is for you yourself to move forward, even when you do recognize your own failures.
Yeah. And so you can't be in a situation, and we're talking, here where I think, just to reframe this a little bit, we're talking now about the seat that you're in when you're working with people, and how you show up as let's just call it a helping professional, someone who's in the business of trying to help someone. And in this particular case, I was actually talking about this earlier with a colleague. Ron Kurtz called this what was it? Sitting squarely in the seat of non-accomplishment.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way of putting it. Absolutely.
And so you can sit in this place where you're reflecting back to the client this challenge that they're facing, but you're doing it in a way where you're not invested in the fact that they have an outcome. You're just holding them in the space of this is their conundrum, and blessings be.
Well, you're still a human being. You're a human being. It's hard facing reality of how we, chase our tails. And, we have to it's hard coming to terms with the fact that this sense of self that we have that stops us from moving forward, it's painful.
It is true.
And I'm not going to judge you for that, but sooner or later you'll realize that you're a rat in a corner and you've only got one option, and that's to move on. But I can't make you move on until you decide to do that.
And we'll just hang out until you do. And if you ever do, let me know.
When
I'll
you
help
do,
you there.
fine, fine, exactly. And that's this is on the individual micro scale, but it's the same principles when we're talking about the big, unsolvable social problems of economy, social inequality, the way we consume resources. That it's like we can't. There's nothing. These are wicked problems. In the same way that trying to intervene in a way that is going to make somebody else move on just pushes them backwards. There's something about not doing here that is powerful.
Exactly. So just holding the space for the person. So the person, I keep going back to, Ron Kurtz and Kobe, because those principles really apply to me in this context. It's like within each of us, there's a principle in the foundations of a company called organicity, and it's basically that, and also holism, that within us is the knowledge about how to move out of the corner. It's like there's an urge that this doesn't feel good, and I want to feel better. And so if you just hold space for that, that eventually the system will reach out towards what it needs. And then you facilitate that emergence, that spontaneous emergence. But until they get that urge, you cannot make it happen.
Exactly. How shall I put it? This is the $1 million question, is how do you cultivate that recognition that there is a place of suffering that person wishes to leave behind, towards a place where they can imagine that suffering being reduced, and the will to do it.
And I think if I could, that the answer in your world to that is how to do that is relationally.
Absolutely. And it's essentially by saying, you're a human being, I'm a human being, I'm not rejecting you. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do anything. You are intrinsically with it. This relationship is unconditional. I'm paid to come here and spend an hour with you a week, and that's the only outcome that is required. That I spend an hour with you every week. and out of that, we'll have a chat, we'll do things, and slowly something, when you feel like there's something you feel confident to do, we can do it. I can help you.
But the way you say that sounds a little dispassionate. Like all I have to do is clock my card and I'm good. But it's more than just spending an hour. It's spending an hour with you.
Yeah. I mean, I have to pay attention to you. I have to be interested in what's going on for you, and I'm also going to go, oh, right, okay. But you are full of shit, aren't you, really? Sometimes, but
a little tough love from Mark Leonard.
I get to the point, the point where I can get away with saying that.
Yeah, well, only whenever you have the connection, authentic connection, and they know that you're doing it in rapport with them in a way where they trust you and they can hear you.
Yeah. Well, it was because they've been able to see it themselves, and you're just saying to them, well, look, you're saying one thing, but you have to, in the end, you have to point out. I do think, from my experience, limited as it is, but that you have to get to a point where you point out, look, you're saying you want to do this, but you're also saying you can't do it because of this.
Yeah.
And you're saying you can't do it. These two things are preventing you. One is preventing you from doing the other, and the other is preventing you from doing this. How are you going to break that cycle?
Yeah. Or in the world that I do, it's kind of like, you could ask the how, but you could also just hang out with them in this discomfort and see what emerges.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly, but it's not saying I'm not waiting for you to do it. I'm just pointing out this is
for you.
And you're not going to move on.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get out of this corner that you find yourself in until you decide to do something about it.
So you help, in my world, you help them explore that as much as they can.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, for sure, yeah.
So it's always so great to talk to you. We have to wrap up here because we're before we sail into another ocean and start talking about what's there, which I would love to do, of course, because it's always so fun to talk with you, and I really appreciate that. Where can people find more about your work and connect with, you have a curriculum that you've developed and all kinds of other stuff. The people who are out there, because, you heard Mark say, like, he's got this course, he's got this whole methodology that's vetted, it's proven, it's in practice, it's ready, and also that there are businesses that can benefit from this. How can people connect with you who are interested in learning more?
Well, I'm actually delivering practitioner training through online through Global Mindfulness Academy, which is, it's a spin out of the Singapore Mindfulness Center.
Okay.
So if you Google MBOE Global Mindfulness Academy, or I think I'm not the website. I could quickly
That's
check
okay.
the website.
We'll put the link for it in the show notes.
Yeah. So that's where I'm currently delivering practitioner training through Global Mindfulness Academy.
Okay.
For practitioners.
So we'll look that up. We'll put that in the show notes and people can find out about you.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of close with, and just thank you so much, and fabulous, brilliant conversation with, because our conversation about listening, and the way that connects us so deeply reminded me of a quote that I love so much from Carl Rogers. And I'm going to read this. It's, there is a peculiar satisfaction in hearing someone. It is like listening to the music of the spheres, because beyond the immediate message of the person, no matter what that might be, there is the universal, the hidden in all the personal communications, which I really hear them in order to be orderly psychological laws and aspects of the same order we find in the universe as a whole. So there is both the satisfaction of hearing this person and also the satisfaction of feeling oneself in touch with what is universally true. And that's a powerful invocation to listen deeply, connect authentically, speak truly, hear, truly hear deeply as well. So thank you so much, Mark. It's always amazing and fun to talk with you. And I hope you'll join us again, and we'll do this another time.
Well, it's always fun having a chat, Brett. Or it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Bye now. The Mindful Coach Podcast is a service of the Mindful Coach Association.